Today I'm going to start with another confession, and it might resonate with more of you than you expect. I've never entirely understood why people join things. Book clubs, sports teams, professional associations, political parties, fan communities. They all pull toward a tribe. That desire to wear the badge and say, I'm one of these people, I've always observed it from a slight distance, with genuine curiosity, but without the instinct to participate. I think I'm sociable. I enjoy people most of the time. I can work a room and I can hold a room, and I've spent 40 years doing both for a professional purpose. But at some point in every group, I notice a moment where everyone else seems to have emotionally paired up with the collective, like Bluetooth devices finding each other. And I'm still standing there, friendly, engaged, yet somehow separate. For most of my life, I assumed this was a minor quirk, or perhaps a mild failing, or even a major failing on my behalf. And then last year, I read the introduction to a book called The Gift of Not Belonging by a psychiatrist named Rami Kaminski. And for the first time in my life, I read a description of myself that seemed accurate. Not approximately accurate, precisely accurate. The word he used was Otrovert. And today, Carl and I are going to trace the full story, from Carl Jung in 1921 to the neuroscience of 2025, of what we actually know about how brains differ in the way they relate to the world around them.
Welcome to my BrainWise coach. I am Cole Bastion.
And I am Phil Dixon.
And today we're tracing a 100-year arc. Carl Jung coined the words introvert and extrovert in the 1920s, and the popular versions of those terms have drifted a long way from what he actually meant. We're going to look at what the original framework was, what the neuroscience has added since, and where the Ambivert and Omnivert fit in, and the new concept that's the reason Phil pitched this episode in the first place, the Otrovert. We'll bring it home through the PTP and the 5 primary drivers. If this show helps you think differently about how your brain works, please leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts, and comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms. You can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach.
And one framing note before we begin. The category labels we're going to discuss today, introvert, extrovert, ambivert, omnivert, otrovert, are useful approximations. They're not strict biological kinds. The continuous picture from the big 5 is the more accurate one, but the labels do real work for people, and we'll get to why.
So Phil, let's start at the beginning. Most people assume introvert and extrovert are fairly simple concepts. One type likes people and one type doesn't. The history, though, is more interesting than that. The terms were introduced by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, in a lecture at Clark University in Massachusetts in 1909. They appeared in print for the first time in 1910 and were fully developed in his 1921 book, Psychological Types. And what Jung actually meant by them is almost unrecognizable from what those words have come to mean in popular usage today.
Almost unrecognizable is the perfect phrase. Jung wasn't describing a sociability preference. He was describing 2 fundamentally different orientations toward reality. The extrovert directs their psychic energy out, toward the object, the world, other people, external events. Their sense of reality is primarily constituted by what is outside of them. On the other hand, the introvert directs their psychic energy inward, toward the subject, their own inner life, their reflections and perceptions. Their sense of reality is primarily constituted by what is inside of them.
Critically, Jung was explicit that both are valid and neither is superior, and that every person contains both. The introvert has a non-conscious extroverted side. The extrovert has a non-conscious introverted side. He wrote that a rhythmic alteration of both functions characteristics the normal course of life. The binary, in other words, was never what he intended.
The binary is precisely what survived, unfortunately. By the 1940s and 1950s, when Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother, Catherine Cook Briggs, built the Myers-Briggs type indicator, loosely based on Jungian typology. Then the introvert-extrovert distinction has actually been turned into a classification. You're either one or the other. Here's your type. And the MBTI went on to become remarkably the most widely used personality assessment in the history of corporate life. It's currently estimated to be administered by, believe it or not, 2 million people per year. At an average cost of $50 a time, that's a lot of money.
It is. We just need a fraction of it, Phil.
There we go.
Yeah. Which really is extraordinary given what the scientific community has had to say about it. The headline criticisms are well rehearsed at this point. The retest reliability is poor. A significant proportion of people who take it twice with an interval of a few weeks get a different result the second time. The 16 types are not empirically derived, but theoretically constructed from Jungian theory. And the forced binary, you are E or I, T or F, J or P, imposes categorical distinctions on what the research consistently shows are continuous dimensions.
And to be fair to the MBTI, which is unusual for me, it's done real good in making personality difference discussable in organizations. It's a serious attempt to bring psychological thinking into corporate life. The scientific community, however, to put it gently, and is not impressed by its validity, but the practical contribution to workplace conversation is genuine. So those two things can both be true at the same time.
The more scientifically robust alternative is the Big Five, or the ocean model: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which emerged from several independent lines of research in the 1980s and 1990s and is consistently supported by cross-cultural data. And the key shift here is that extroversion in the Big Five is not a type. It is a continuous dimension, normally distributed across the population, with the majority of people sitting somewhere toward the middle.
It is that middle, that large population of people who are neither particularly extroverted nor particularly introverted, that gave rise to the concept of the ambivert, which we'll come to and discuss a bit later. But first, the neuroscience.
Yeah, before we get to the ambiverts and everything that followed, I want to press on the neuroscience because Jung was working from clinical observation. So what does the brain research actually show us, Phil?
It shows us that the neuroscience of introversion and extroversion is one of the most genuinely robust areas of personality research, which is not always true of personality psychology. And it starts with Eysenck, who proposed in the 1960s what he called the cortical arousal theory. We touched on this in our podcast on music and focus. The basic idea is that introverts and extroverts differ in their baseline level of cortical arousal, the level of stimulation at which the brain is running at rest. Introverts have a higher baseline. They're already running close to their optimal level of stimulation without any external input. On the other hand, extroverts have a lower baseline. They need that external stimulation to reach their optimal cognitive state and emotional state.
Which explains why extroverts seek out noise, company, and activity, and why introverts find the same things exhausting. They're both trying to reach the same destination, just by different routes. The extrovert adds stimulation because they need it. The introvert avoids stimulation because they already have enough. And the principle underneath is Yerkes-Dodson: too much stimulation degrades performance just as much as too little. The extrovert at a party is moving toward optimal. The introvert at the same party is typically past it. And so, Phil, what about the neurochemical evidence?
Before we go to that, I just want to point out that Yerkes-Dodson came up with that, I think it was in 1905. So it's 120 years ago. So it's withstood the test of time. So anyway, you're exactly right. And the neurochemical evidence is where it gets genuinely interesting. The research converges on two neurotransmitters playing different roles. Extroverts appear to have a more active dopamine reward pathway, as dopamine is the brain's primary motivation and reward signal, associated with novelty seeking, social interaction, risk-taking, the pursuit of external stimulation, and just general enjoyment. Extroverts' brains are more sensitive to dopamine's effects in social and reward-laden contexts. They get a bigger neurochemical return from interaction and stimulation, which is why they seek it.
And introverts rely more heavily on acetylcholine, a different neurotransmitter associated with introspection, sustained focus, deep thinking, and the capacity to feel content in calm environments. Acetylcholine rewards more quietly and more slowly than dopamine. It's released when you're reading, thinking carefully, having a deep one-to-one conversation. For the introvert's brain, those activities are genuinely rewarding in a neurochemical sense, not merely tolerated, actively rewarding. The introvert who retreats to read after a social event is not being antisocial. They're restoring a neurochemical balance that the social event disrupted.
And quite frankly, that distinction is one of the most useful reframes I know for couples and teams who don't share the same extroversion baseline. The retreat, going away, removing yourself from the group, is not rejection. It's their way of getting restoration.
Phil, is this visible in brain imaging?
All the time. Functional MRI studies show that introverts exhibit greater activity in the prefrontal cortex, which everyone knows now is the region associated with planning, abstract thinking, decision-making, and internal processing. Extroverts show stronger activity in regions associated with sensory processing from the outside and reward anticipation. The paths that sensory information takes through the brain are literally longer in introverts, passing through more processing stages, which is why introverts tend to reflect before responding, and extroverts tend to respond and then reflect. Neither's better. They're different architectures for different purposes.
The dopamine pathway is physically shorter than the acetylcholine pathway, which is why extroverts gain their reward faster. The extrovert's reward system is built for speed. The introvert's is built for depth. A party gives the extrovert an immediate dopamine return. It gives the introvert a slower, smaller one, and the acetylcholine reward of the conversation they have the following day, processing what happened, is probably larger.
The last point matters way more than it might sound. The introvert's reward often arrives a day late, upon reflection. If you measure the experience only in the moment, you systematically underestimate what it gave to the introverts.
Now to ambiversion, because this is often presented as a recent discovery, and it really isn't. The concept appears in the psychological literature as early as 1923, just 2 years after Jung's Psychological Types was published. Some of Jung's own contemporaries argued that the majority of people constitute a third class, the less differentiated middle, and that the binary was already a distortion. What changed is that this has taken a century for popular usage to catch up with that observation.
Which is way longer. Normally it takes about 10 years for scientific observations to come into the public domain. That one took 100. And what is the move from deficit reframing? The middle of a continuous distribution is often described as undifferentiated, lacking strong characteristics in either direction. Grant's contributions show that the middle has its own strengths, which are different from the strengths of either extreme.
The explanation is intuitive. The ambivert has access to both registers. They can bring energy and social engagement when the situation calls for it, and they can bring reflective listening and careful thought when that is what is needed. They're not compromisers between the two extremes. They're more flexible than either.
And balanced. Alan Grant at Wharton has done the most cited work on this. His research on, believe it or not, sales performance found that ambiverts, those right in the middle of that extroversion spectrum, consistently outperformed both extreme introverts and extreme extroverts. The explanation is pretty intuitive. The ambivert has access to both registers. They can bring energy and social engagement when the situation calls for it, and they can bring reflective listening and careful thought when that's what's needed. They're not compromises between the two extremes, so like some bland middle position. They're more flexible on either.
Neurologically, what does that look like?
The ambivert's brain probably has neurotransmitter sensitivities and arousal baselines that fall between the extremes. Their dopamine and acetylcholine systems are balanced in a way that allows them to find genuine reward in both social stimulation and quiet reflection, without either of them being overwhelming. They're not exhausted by parties, and they're not bored by solitude. The flexibility is real, and it is neurological, as you say.
There is the Omnivert, which seems to be a different concept again, and a more contested one. The Omnivert is described as someone who swings dramatically between introverted and extroverted states, not balancing them as an ambivert does, but oscillating between extremes depending on mood and situation. One day, the life of the party, the next day, unable to tolerate any social contact at all. The speculation is that omniverts have highly reactive neural systems that respond dramatically to environmental and neurochemical fluctuations. But the skeptics are pointed. Richard Roberts at UC Davis argues that omniversion probably doesn't exist as a stable personality type, that it describes context-sensitive behavior, which everyone exhibits to some degree, rather than a distinct neurological profile.
Yeah, and I don't say this with scientific evidence, but I think Robbins is probably right. Most of what gets labeled as omniversion is just the ordinary variability for human behavior across different contexts and energy states. Calling that a personality type adds a category without adding any sufficient explanation. The jury, as they say, is still out. But the burden on proof is the people claiming it's a distinct type.
Which brings us to where this conversation began. The book you read by Rami Kaminski, and on the Otrovert.
Kaminski is a psychiatrist at Mount Sinai in New York, and he spent years observing a pattern in his patients that didn't fit the existing vocabulary or explanation. People who were sociable and empathetic and capable of genuine warmth and close relationships, but who consistently felt in group settings like they were on the outside of something rather than on the inside. Not because they're anxious, not because they lack the skills, because something about the auto-pairing mechanism that pulls most people into emotional alignment with a group simply didn't fire for them.
And his book is The Gift of Not Belonging, published in 2025, and the term he coined, Otrovert, comes from outro, the Spanish word derived from the Latin meaning other, and vert from the Latin for to turn toward. The outrovert is literally someone facing a different direction. Not inward like the introvert and not outward like the extrovert, but elsewhere. So Phil, what is the Bluetooth phenomenon? Because that is the image I find most striking in the entire description.
Kaminski observes that most people have what he calls a Bluetooth circuit. It's not a real circuit, but a social auto-pairing system that activates when they're in a group and connects them emotionally to the collective. When you pair, you press two buttons and the thing pairs. That's what he's likening it to. The group feels excited and the individual feels excited. The group feels solemn and they feel solemn. The group affiliates with a team, a brand, a leader, a cause, and the individual's emotional system pairs with that affiliation more or less automatically. It's a deeply social function. It's what makes tribes cohere. What makes audience move together, it what makes organizations develop genuine cultures rather than just a collection of individuals.
And the Outrovert's Bluetooth system doesn't pair?
It may do, but it pairs much less readily. When I read that passage, I recognized something I have personally experienced hundreds of times but never had words for it. Being in a room where everybody else has clearly emotionally emerged with each other, the collective, the excitement of the conference, the devotion of the product launch, the tribal identification of the political rally, and I've been to several of those, and feeling genuinely curious about it, genuinely friendly toward the people in the room, but not feeling the same that they did. Watching it happen rather than being inside it.
critical move that Kaminski makes, the one I think that distinguishes this from a lot of pop psychology category invention, is that this is explicitly not pathology. The Outrovert is not antisocial, not anxious, not avoidant, not a person with a relational disorder. They are empathetic and capable of genuine closeness. In fact, Kaminski argues that the one-to-one relationship is where the Outrovert is most fully themselves.
Yeah, I can speak from personal experience. They don't belong to groups. As a kid, everybody else was belonging to the Boy Scouts. Not me. I started off going to the Boys Brigade and then going on my own. They do belong to individuals. We belong to ourselves. Deep, specific, chosen relationships with the people they've decided matter to them. But the group belonging mechanism, the fan, the tribe, the member, the joiner, the person who wears the jersey, is simply not part of their wiring.
What does Kaminski say about what drives this? Is there a neurological account?
You know me, I'm going to give you the honest answer, and that's that the neuroscience of Otroversion is not yet established. Kaminski himself calls for more research. But through the lens of the 5P model, the account becomes coherent. The participation driver, which monitors the brain's sense of belonging, tribal membership, and social inclusion, operates differently in the Otrovert. For most people, this driver is powerfully activated in threat when they feel excluded, and powerfully activated in reward when they feel genuinely included. The prospect of group belonging is both appealing and meaningful to them. On the other hand, the Otrovert's participation driver appears to be calibrated differently. It's not threatened by non-belonging, not strongly rewarded by belonging. The group membership equation that the rest of the world finds compelling is simply not producing the same neurochemical signal. In our questions in the PTP model, people who are Otroverts are not going to respond in one extreme or the other.
Which means the Outrovert is not avoiding something. They're genuinely not missing something they want. And that is the distinction that makes Kaminski's contribution useful, beyond the pop psychology criticism it has attracted. The introvert avoids groups because groups are overstimulating. They want the reward, but the cost is too high. The anxious person avoids groups because groups feel threatening. The Outrovert is not avoiding groups. They're simply not oriented toward them. The direction of their attention, their belonging, their loyalty, it runs elsewhere, towards ideas, towards individual relationships, towards their own chosen interests, and towards the edges, rather than the center of any collective. Kaminski suggests that certain historical figures were Outroverts: Einstein, Kafka, Frida, George Orwell, and you can count yourself among them. Phil?
I read the introduction of Kaminski's book and felt for the first time that I'd been described accurately. As I said earlier on, not approximately, precisely. I'm not an introvert. I don't find groups draining in the way introverts describe. On the other hand, I'm not an extrovert. I don't get my energy from collective engagement. I'm not an ambivert. The concept of balancing both suggests that they're both available in roughly equal measure, and the group belonging experience is simply not available in the way it seems to be for many other people. The word Kaminski coined fits me. I'm oriented elsewhere. Ask my wife, she'll tell you that. And by that strict measurement standard, the proliferation of vert labels, introvert, extrovert, ambivert, omnivert, Otrovert, is an attempt to impose categories, or is it actually a continuous and multidimensional space? Each new label, in a way, is in a sense a category error. We talked about the big five, and that research makes one thing very clear. Personality is not categorical. Extroversion is a dimension, not a type. Most people fall somewhere in the middle. The proliferation of all these labels that I mentioned just now is from a strict measurement perspective, an attempt to impose categories in what is actually a continuous and multidimensional space. Colin DeYoung, Minnesota, has said directly that there's no such thing as personal types in the empirical sense. No sharp boundaries, no categorical distinctions, just continuous variation on multiple dimensions.
Yet a lot of time All of us find these categories genuinely useful to some degree. And I've seen it in my own experience at work. People love learning about themselves. And sometimes categories and models help us make perspective or create perspective of what might be happening. And this just means that we have to take seriously the gap between empirical accuracy and then practical utility. I think there are two reasons worth distinguishing why a label can be technically imprecise and still genuinely valuable.
Okay, you got me intrigued. Tell me what you think they are.
The first is the recognition function. A good personality description does not tell you something you did not know about yourself. It gives you language for something you already know. The value is in the naming, not in the discovery. When you read Kaminski's description of the Otrovert, you weren't learning something new about yourself. You were being given a word for something you always had experienced. That's genuinely useful whether or not Otroversion survives as a validated construct in the academic literature.
The second, if I may take over from you, is what Kaminski called the permission function. He writes that recognizing yourself as an Otrovert gives you permission to opt out of things that cause you discomfort, to forge deeper relationships with those you feel close to, and embrace your authentic self rather than spending energy trying to manufacture a belonging that was never going to feel natural. The clinical and coaching value of that permission is real, independent of the neurological validity of the category. How many people have spent years feeling that their failure to fully bond with a group was a deficiency, me being one of them? Kaminski's framework says, nothing's wrong with you, which I was delighted to hear. You're just oriented differently. That's a different thing entirely.
The academic skeptic's response would be that this is the appeal of any personality framework. Myers-Briggs makes millions of people feel seen and validated, and its scientific validity is still questionable. So why should the Otrovert get credit for something the MBTI gets criticized for?
That's a fair challenge, and I'm glad you brought it up. The answer, I think, is that the value of a framework should be judged on two dimensions separately: its scientific validity and its utility, whether that's clinical or coaching. Myers-Briggs has really low scientific validity and genuine coaching utility. One guy, when I was doing a presentation many years ago, he said, "You missed the point. Myers-Briggs answers all the questions." And for some people, in some way, it does. The big five that we talked about has high scientific validity, but low accessibility for most of the people who are non-specialists. The best frameworks have got a bit of both.
And the Otrovert concept is too new for its scientific validity to be properly assessed. Its utility for the people it describes appears to be significant. The honest position is to hold both questions open rather than collapsing them into each other.
Yeah, it gets to keep a balance of what it might be. I read it and it resonated with me, and I'm going to guess that for many people it will resonate with them, but not with everybody. The introvert-extrovert dimension maps directly onto only two of the five Ps. The first is pleasure, specifically what kinds of experience the brain finds intrinsically rewarding. The dopamine-driven extrovert finds reward in social stimulation, novelty, external engagement. The acetylcholine-driven introvert finds reward in quiet reflection, deep thinking, and solitude. The pleasure driver is pointing in different directions, toward different kinds of experience for different people. Prediction, on the other hand, specifically the arousal component, the introvert's higher baseline arousal means that additional stimulation more readily pushes them past and over the top of their optimal state, which the brain experiences as a threat. The extrovert's lower baseline means that additional stimulation is welcomed rather than threatening. The prediction driver's monitoring of the brain's cognitive state is differently calibrated in both cases.
And the Outrovert is a participation story, right?
Yeah, primarily. The participation driver monitors belonging, tribal membership, and social inclusion. For most people, this driver is powerful in both directions. Strongly threatened by exclusion, strongly rewarded by genuine inclusion. The pull toward the group is partly a participation driver phenomenon. The Otrovert's participation driver appears to be calibrated differently. Less threatened by non-belonging, less rewarded by belonging. More oriented towards the individual relationship or relationships than the collective one. They're not low on participation, they have a different expression on it. Connection matters enormously to them. Collective connection simply doesn't activate them in the same way.
It means that in a coaching context, understanding someone's position on all three dimensions, pleasure, prediction, and participation, produces a much more precise and useful picture than the simplified introvert-extrovert label can. And the practical implication is significant. An introvert and an outrovert may look similar on the surface. Both tend to avoid large group settings, both prefer depth over breadth in their relationships. But the reason is entirely different. The introvert is managing stimulation, while the outrovert is managing belonging.
The intervention that helps one, from a coach's point of view, won't necessarily help the other. Giving an introvert a smaller, quieter group helps. Giving an outrovert a smaller, quieter group doesn't fundamentally change their experience of being separate from it, because separateness is not the problem. It's the condition.
This has been one of the most personally revealing conversations that I think we've had on our podcast for a while now. It's been really enlightening, I know, for myself. I feel like I understand several people I know significantly better than I did maybe an hour ago.
Which is the point, I think. It's not to label people. I'm an outrovert. And by the way, I hate being labeled, which is what you would expect. The academic skeptics are right that the labels are approximations. But to understand that the differences in how people relate to the world around them are real. They're neurological. They're not deficiencies or preferences or choices. The introvert is not failing at extroversion. The Otrovert is not failing at belonging. They're different architectures running on different neurochemistry, oriented in different directions. Different people.
And the goal is not to make everyone face the same way. It is to understand which way each person faces and to design our organizations, our teams, our conversations, and our expectations accordingly. Jung said it first in 1921, a rhythmic alteration of both psychic functions characterizes the normal course of life. He would probably be appalled by what's maybe been done with the Myers-Briggs type indicators.
He would be appalled by Myers-Briggs, and I suspect genuinely interested in Kaminski. Because Kaminski is doing what Jung did, sitting with patients, noticing a pattern, giving it a name, and asking what that name's for how we understand what it is to be human. Whether the neuroscience catches up with the concept, that remains to be seen. The experience it describes is real. I know that from the inside.
As always, thank you for spending time with us today. If you enjoyed today's conversation, give us a 5-star rating and review wherever it is that you get your podcast, and comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social pages. You can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach. So until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brainwise.